to pay for that. So the costs of that transition. Now, in a second, you'll be hearing from my colleague Bill Anderson-Samways from the SMF, who's written a fascinating paper trying to talk through, well, partly trying to answer that question of those questions of who, when, how to pay, but also trying to help us think about the questions involved, because they're quite complicated questions. Before I get to the panel and their role, however, I should just tell you, you may have seen on your screen a little red light going on to tell you that not only is this session being recorded, we are now also being broadcast or narrowcast or mediumcast to YouTube. So when we come to the Q&A, and we're very keen to get questions and contributions and thoughts from the audience to discuss with our panelists. Just bear in mind that you're talking to the infinite internet out there, and also that your contributions to this session will be kept online forever. So as part of the SMF's YouTube channel, which is always a nice thing, and then we get, while we have the live audience, we also have people who like to watch these things again afterwards in the privacy of their own homes and offices. Maybe those offices will include HM Treasury, because in a way the Treasury is responsible for this event today, as Bill will be explaining shortly, because when the Treasury issued its net zero review paper in the autumn, it possibly accidentally, possibly intentionally, we don't know, raised some very interesting questions about where the costs of the net zero transition should be allocated and how. But I'm in danger of preempting a little bit Bill's Bill's contribution. You'll see just appearing on your screen as I've been talking, Angus Hampton of the Intergenerational Foundation, who are the co-sponsors and co-supporters of this project.
James, thanks.
The name, you probably, I'll leave it to Angus when we hear from later on to explain what the Intergenerational Foundation is all about, but I think the name probably describes it quite well. Anyway, so the running order, as promised, we'll hear from Bill Anderson-Samways on his paper published today at www.smf.co.uk. We will then have a response from we've captured a practicing politician, Vera Hobhouse of the Liberal Democrats, to talk about to give us her response, because as you'll hear from Bill, we're talking about sort of essentially very political, difficult decisions that have to be made, and someone needs to make some choices here, and some of the allocative and distributive choices involved in funding the net zero transition might be a little painful, might be a little awkward. They're quite tricky, tough choices, as they used to say in the New Labour days, and that's what we have politicians for, in theory, to make difficult decisions in the long-term national interest. Well, I think it used to be once upon a time. I know that stuff's out of fashion, but anyway, we can dream. One day we'll have politicians who make long-term decisions in the national interest. Anyway, that is probably more than enough from me. So I'm going to hand over to Bill and his slides, and then I'll pop back up again when Bill's finished talking you through the fascinating questions of the discount rate and how much value to assign to the equity and happiness of future generations yet unborn. I love running a think tank. It's great. It's a great way to spend a Tuesday morning. Anyway, I'm going to put Buzzel on mute and enjoy listening to this with the rest of you.
Thanks, James. So, morning, everyone. I'm Bill. I'm a researcher at the Social Market Foundation. To just very briefly introduce myself and why I'm here. So I wrote the briefing note, which hopefully serves as the kind of launching point for this discussion. I did that in collaboration with my colleague, John Hobby at the Intergenerational Foundation, who should be in the virtual audience today and who did some of the more difficult technical stuff. So, firstly, I'm really grateful for our collaboration with IF, and thank you very much to everyone who's attending today, both in the audience and on the panel. So this is our new briefing on borrowed time. And I just want to give a bit of background to the briefing first. So we start with what we see as a pretty basic fact, which is that the transition to a net zero economy is going to require, to put it mildly, huge amounts of investment across very long time periods, so multiple decades. in fact. And what we're aiming to answer in this briefing is, what does that mean from the perspective of future generations or of intergenerational fairness? And more specifically, we answer two questions. And the first is, what is the fairest way of distributing the costs of the transition across time? So in other words, how much should we invest now as opposed to in later decades? And the major policy the report looks at here is, as James mentioned, the discount rate. If that sounds dry and a little bit boring, it's because it is, but it's very important. And basically what it is it's a measurement of how much we can discount, or if you like, disregard the interests of future generations or when making a particular policy decision. So if the discount rate is high, it means that we place less emphasis on future generations. If the discount rate is low, then we place more emphasis on future generations. And there are a few reasons why policymakers do discount future generations. For example, the fact that they might be richer than us, but we'll come on to that in a second. And the second question, which you'll be relieved to hear is a little bit simpler, is how should we pay? And by this, really what we mean is it fairer to pay for the transition through government borrowing or through carbon pricing? So placing a price on carbon emissions through either taxation or through emissions trading. And what we found is, when answering both of these questions, three considerations are really important. And the first is quite simple. It's how much do we value future generations in a moral sense? The second is, how do we feel about economic inequality, both across time and within the present generation, and also about economic risk, so risks to future economic growth. Are we very averse to these things, or not so much? And then thirdly, how likely is future growth? So in other words, how much do we expect the economy to grow in the future, and how certain are we of that? So obviously these are pretty complicated questions. We couldn't answer them ourselves in a very short briefing note. So instead what we did is we used the assumptions from this document here, which is the Treasury's net zero review. And we did this for a couple of reasons, which James has alluded to. Firstly, the net zero review is very important in terms of this question of how to pay for the transition. And secondly, it talks a bit about these questions of intergenerational fairness. So we wanted to see how consistent that was with government policy, basically. And what we found is the net zero review makes a number of important assumptions relative to these questions. So firstly, it implies that future generations are our complete moral equals. Secondly, it's pretty worried about economic inequality and the risks from climate change. And finally, it's pretty skeptical about the possibility for the transition generating really high levels of economic growth. And what that means, if we take these assumptions to their logical conclusion, is that if we care about future generations, if we're worried about risks to their well-being, if we're worried about limits to economic growth, which may deliver that well-being, and we're worried that that growth will end up badly distributed, then we shouldn't discount future generations very much. We should lower the discount rate. In other words, what we should do is we should pay more now rather than later. And secondly, we should pay mainly via carbon pricing rather than very long-term borrowing, because with very long-term borrowing, future generations would pick up the cost when they themselves should not be responsible for absorbing the cost because they haven't caused it. And secondly, if growth is really low, they might not be able to afford the cost of servicing that debt. So how does current UK policy compare to this? So where it comes to discount rates, how to distribute the costs, it's kind of a mix. So in terms of the positives, there's some very good things. Discounting is not used at all when we determine what our climate targets should be in the first place. So instead what we do is we've just decided that we're going to reach net zero by 2050, and that is now enshrined in UK law. We don't employ discounting there. And it's also not used in the UK emissions trading scheme, which is the UK's biggest carbon pricing programme. But discount rates are still used in lots of other areas of climate policy. So for example, when we set energy efficiency standards, we use discount rates. But the UK is also fairly innovative relative to other countries in that its discount rates decline after 30 years, reflecting the fact that we're more uncertain about the future beyond this point, and so should be more cautious. On the other hand, the main UK discounting policy, which is the UK Treasury's Green Book, which you can see on the right here, it still morally discounts future generations. So it implicitly treats them as less worthy of moral consideration. It also fails to account for inequality, and it fails to account for uncertainties in GDP growth shorter than 30 years. So for uncertainties during the transition period, which is something the net zero review emphasizes a bit more. On carbon pricing, again, things are a bit more simple. So the government likes carbon pricing as an option. It wants to expand it. But the downside is that carbon prices are probably not anywhere near high enough at the moment. So pricing really needs to be ramped up. The government recognizes that, but we think it needs to be held to account on that, essentially. So to sum up, our recommendations are to decrease the discount rate, to put future generations on an equal moral footing with ourselves, and to also alter the methodology used to calculate it so that it can incorporate both inequality and risks to economic growth in the near term. The second is that we need to greatly expand carbon pricing in order to ensure that we hit that net zero target and avoid unacceptable costs to future generations. And then finally, we should use those higher receipts from much stronger carbon pricing to allow us to avoid an over-reliance on borrowing, but without sacrificing mitigation. So the net zero review itself says that we shouldn't borrow very much, but it also doesn't recommend ramping up carbon pricing at the same time, which is problematic to say the least, because obviously our first obligation to future generations is to deal with climate change, which requires much stronger carbon prices. So there are some remaining questions, however, which I'd be really interested to get our other panelists' reflections on. And the first is, how politically feasible are these measures? And this is probably more a question for Vera. The second is, what broader policies or institutions are needed to make climate policy in general more intergenerationally fair? It's maybe more of a question for Angus. And then finally, maybe a more provocative question for all of us to think about is our first obligation to future generations just to deliver net zero rather than getting hung up on the best ways of paying for it? But these are just some suggestions, and I'd be really interested to take the conversation in whatever direction our panelists would like. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Bill. Admirable job of condensing quite a tricky topic into a relatively short space. So well done you. So I'm going to ask for a first response to that from Vera, because Vera, as you're an actual politician. You have to live in the political real world that us deracinated think tankers try to avoid at all costs. So when you think about, almost Bill's last question around, or all the last questions around, there's just a simple allocate of intergenerational questions. Isn't the temptation always for politicians to just do the thing that puts off cost and trouble today onto somebody else? Because we're talking intergenerationally, but don't you also think in terms of electoral cycles? Isn't it much easier just to say, we'll borrow the money, we'll delay the cost until the next generation, the next next cycle? Is that, how do you balance that political pressure with the argument that you've heard sketched out by Bill there, that actually there's a good moral case for us, today's generations, accepting some of this cost in the here and now?
Well, James, you've already stolen some of my thunder by sort of putting, laying out what the dilemma is for a lot of politicians. So there are, first of all, two types of politicians, and not or many types of politicians. So you get people who get into politics because they're very passionate about particular issues, and others just get into politics because they're interested in politics and they're happy that they have been elected. And there's always a little bit of the two in each politician, I would say, because after all, you need to, if you want to change something and you're passionate about it and you think you're the right person to do that change and drive that change. And of course, the first thing that you need to make sure of is that you get elected. It's no good if I don't get elected and then I sit there and I can't do anything with my passion and my drive. So there's always the two considerations that, yes, I want something to change. Yes, I have a particular political agenda. I want to deliver it, but I need to get elected. And then you have to look at, where are the people? So politics is in that space where you have ideas, but you also have to consider where the people are. Can you influence the people? How much can you get people on your side? How good are you at persuading? And this is, I think, where we all are. I think most politicians, well, not all politicians, but certainly from the opposition benches, I think we are all pretty clear that we need to do something now and soon and make it intergenerationally fair and all the things that Bill has set out in order to have a positive future for people who are growing up now and are older in 2050, let's say, or my age. So of course we understand that. But how do we persuade best now in order to make that happen? And it is clear that only about 20% of the current voting population is actually really behind net zero and is prepared to make that investment and put up that cost. Of course, we can always say it has to be fair, and then we get into the detail of who can actually pay for it. And even middle income earner would say, I'm poor. So people will always say, oh, why me? So we have to create a political narrative of fairness. And I think that is currently lacking in the political space to sort of say, look, this would be fair. And I believe one of the biggest failures of the current government is that they are talking a lot about net zero, they do, but they don't really talk about the delivery of net zero. And many things, many organizations have already said we need a centralizing body, whether that's devolved to regional levels or at government level, for a net zero delivery authority, where people can really think about these things rather than talk about it, and then set out a very clear narrative and vision that then the people can buy into. Currently, all they're being told is it costs money, and currently most people will say, I don't want to pay for it, and therefore I won't vote for you next time. But if there is a clear narrative set out by whoever feels the responsibility and is prepared to go to the electorate and said, on this, I want you to vote for me, and set out the arguments for why that is intergenerationally fair, why ultimately we can't create now a massive division between the young and the old, then that would be a way forward. But we need somebody to coordinate what needs to be done, what each thing will cost, how we socialize cost, and how we are directing costs more either at businesses or the people who can more afford it, and make that politically acceptable. Unless we have at government level somebody, a net zero delivery authority, then I don't think we are going to get there. And let me just say one thing. I mean, I'm a member of the Future Generations APPG, and it is absolutely right what you say, James, is that because of our election cycles of about 4 or 5 years, sometimes even less, short-term thinking is embedded in our political structures, and how to overcome it in the view of the climate emergency is very difficult. And let me say one other thing. If there is a real crisis that people can see in front of their eyes, like COVID, and we are still in COVID, the government has done some extraordinary things, coercing people into things that we would have never contemplated to do only a few years ago. But we did it because there was a crisis, and people understood there was a crisis and they had to stay at home. But the climate emergency is never quite painted in that picture. The virus is not here. The catastrophic global warming is not really feasible for people. And it is very much, I don't know, whoever has watched the film Don't Look Up, it's something that people do not see. And unless actually the meteorite is falling onto us, people don't see it. So these are the difficulties. Short-termism embedded in politics. How do we overcome that? How can we actually make the case for a real crisis and act in it as if it was like a COVID crisis where we coerce a lot of people into something? And third, actually have a net zero delivery authority at government level who sets out a very clear narrative of why we need to do this.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions for you. One of which, the second of which, will hopefully set up Angus's contribution quite well. Just on the first question, I suppose I was just thinking when you're talking about the challenge of delivering long-term policy, and I was racking my brains trying to think of examples, essentially country examples where actually politics has succeeded in doing difficult long-term things. And I suppose the example that came to mind was essentially the policy, the technocratic policy wonks favorite, pensions auto-enrollment. Because there we have a policy that essentially involves taking some money out of the pockets of a lot of people over many years, because we, the elite policy-making community, if you like, have decided that that is in their interest and in the national interest. And that, I think auto-enrollment really deserves more attention than it gets, and it doesn't get enough attention because it's been so successful in its own terms. It's delivered what it wanted to do with very little political trouble. There hasn't actually been any significant political pushback against a policy that involves removing some cash from people's pockets every month. Even at the moment, I was talking to someone about this the other day, even in the teeth of a cost of living crisis, I haven't yet, maybe I've missed it, seen anybody serious suggesting that we ought to revisit pension auto-enrollment and let people, make it easier or more frictionless for people to cut their pension contributions. So is that, auto-enrollment came about essentially because the politicians got together and decided to give the decision to somebody else. They got Adair Turner and the Turner Commission to go away and devise a system. It came back and all the parties said, yeah, that sounds sensible, we'll do that. Is it necessary when it comes to these big long-term intergenerational decisions? Do you politicians have to sort of essentially take a back seat and try and hand the decision off to somebody else, do you think?
Well, we have talked about this health and social care crisis for a long time and said, we need to actually get a cross-party consensus around that. And where are we with that? The thing with pensions is, of course, that in the end, a narrative could be created where people could clearly see why that would benefit them. Yeah, and why we are living in a world where a lot of solidarity has broken down, and as a sort of center-left politicians, I regret that, because where are we? And I believe that has been a very right-wing agenda since Thatcher, where everybody is just being told to look after themselves rather than looking at their own well-being in context of the wider society. We don't have that consensus anymore, that we need to look out for each other in order to live a good life. We are all just sort of making sure that we are okay. I think how to fix it, I don't know, but the politics of solidarity has completely been written out of politics, and therefore we find it incredibly difficult and increasingly difficult to make these long-term societal changes that should benefit everybody, but people don't see it that way.
No, I'm sorry, that's a good point. I think you're right. The pension is not the same as net zero, because obviously my pension saving is a gift to my future self, whereas my contributions to net zero may well be a gift to be a gift to generations yet unborn who come after me after my death, frankly. So we're talking about a longer time frame. And you've started to preview the other question I was going to ask you, which was essentially around the bigger, I guess, the social and political dimensions around intergenerational fairness. And you're now a grizzled veteran of Parliament. You've been in the Commons for five years now, which is in dog years must feel like a lifetime. But you're in politics long before that, of course. Do you think that in the last 10, 15, 20 years, we've actually seen a worsening of the intergenerational tension, I suppose, that has the balance that we between the generational interests, has it tipped significantly in the last 10, 15, 20 years, or are we just talking about it more because we talk about everything more now?
Well, first of all, talking about things more is not necessarily a bad thing.
I've made my career doing it, haven't I?
I think for a long time, the narrative was there that each generation would do better than the previous generation. And that is clearly not the case anymore. And maybe because of that, there was actually for a long time some political sleepiness or complacency about a young generation to take part in elections, and therefore, the older people get their say, and politicians pander then towards the pensioners, the older people, the people in work. Because that is no longer the case, the younger generation is making their voices heard. In terms of democracy, that's a good thing. I mean, you could say, is it a good thing because they're doing it out of because they're in a crisis and they really feel very much neglected? But I think there's nothing worse for democracy than a sort of silent group of demographics who don't talk and don't say what they want. And this is. There's always been the problem of my generation. So growing up in the 70s and 80s, that, young people just didn't really do very much except at university. And, we had during the Cold War, a big ideological divide between sort of communism and capitalism. But otherwise, most young people didn't say anything. And therefore, politicians sort of ignored them. That they're now making themselves heard, and I hope they make themselves more heard, means that politicians need to listen up. That, I think, can only be a good thing, but they need to do, I think that the younger generation needs to do more of it. And they're just about waking up to the fact that they need to get politically engaged in order to have their voices heard and their future secured.
Thank you. Which, as I say, seamlessly you paved the way for young Angus Hanton from the Intergenerational Foundation, who will give us the IF's view of the questions we're talking about today. Angus, how should we? To come back to the original question, how should we pay for net zero? Who should pay? Which generation and how?
Thanks, James. Thanks very much for hosting this as well, and thanks, Bill, for your fantastic paper, which I know got some help on from John Hobby. So you and John have done a great job. So I'm Angus Hanton, a trustee and volunteer for the Intergenerational Foundation, and James's question is very much sort of relates back to the paper. How should the paper really says we should do more now and not push the costs onto future generations. But I suppose future generations are represented by really three groups, aren't they? They're represented by institutions, and the idea of a net zero delivery authority is the sort of institution that we would very much support. They're represented by young people who are the nearest we've got to future generations. And they'll be around for longer than us by definition. And they're represented to some extent by older people who recognize the need. And it's quite interesting to see how many older people do recognize that the legacy they want to leave is not a burnt up planet, but a place that's livable and where there's a better outlook for future generations. So when Vera talks about the politics of solidarity, which have traditionally meant solidarity between social classes, and she's referring also to solidarity between old and young, I think we need to recast what we mean by solidarity to mean between old and young and future generations. So it's a slightly strange notion that we should have solidarity with people who don't exist, but I think it's a good notion, and it's one that people are starting to be aware of. Moving to, if I may, James, to a couple of points on the paper. I mean, one of the things that Bill and John have brought out very clearly is the question of who pays, in terms of does the polluter pay, or should the polluted pay? I mean, we all generally accept the principle that if we make a mess, we should clear it up. What would happen if we made future generations pay for the carbon that we've emitted is effectively saying we'll make the mess and they should clear it up. And that just instinctively seems unfair. Picking up a point on the discount rate, it's always, for a long time, it's been a problem that governments set a discount rate which is too high. In other words, they put too little emphasis on the future, which is very much the point that Vera makes about short-term politics. And it requires, I think, people who understand what this means, almost this technical number at the heart of so much policy making, it requires us to really make sure that the government get it, that it needs to be a lower rate, which implicitly therefore puts more importance on younger generations. And I'm afraid civil servants are conflicted on this, because in terms of their own pensions, they have an interest in having a higher discount rate. And it's clear it has influenced that over the last few years. And then that same similar higher discount rate is used for other policy decisions. So it's technical, but it's important. And I think
Angus, I should probably, in fairness, I should channel the voice of Treasury officials, if they are on the call or elsewhere, who would probably question your suggestion that they've skewed policy because of their own pension interests. But we'll just note that. Absolutely, they would challenge it. But I'm afraid that this is a situation where they unreasonably act as judge and jury. They set the discount rate, and that affects how much pension contribution they make and how much their pensions are thought to cost. If I'd been in their position 10 years ago, I would have said, I'm conflicted here. We need a separate body, but like an independent Bank of England, a separate independent body, which will work out what the right discount rate is for different purposes. They've tried to create a bit of independence. The Green Book is an attempt to explicitly say what the discount rate should be for different purposes, but it's still not really independent of their own interests. I mean, I suppose that the Intergenerational Foundation's fundamental view is that all government policies and decisions should be assessed in terms of their fairness towards future generations. And we need mechanisms that make us stand back and say, is this fair on younger and future generations? And for too many policies, a whole raft of them, we've ignored the interests of younger and future generations. If you think of just younger generations, I mean, they've really suffered because of high house prices, the end of final salary pensions. They've suffered from student debt, the amount of nuclear waste that's been created without properly putting aside money to pay for dealing with that. And of course, at heart, they've also suffered from a tax system that taxes the one thing that they can get, which is earned income, very heavily, and the one thing that they don't have, which is wealth or assets, very lightly. So a tax system which is stacked against younger generations it is a problem which I think they're waking up to. Thank you very much, Angus. Now we now have about 25 minutes for some questions from our audience and others. I'm actually going to go, if that's all right. I think we can put some people on camera. Hopefully, hopefully my colleagues can do that. The first person I'd like to get Andy Mayer up to ask a question. Now, Andy, are you with us? Yeah, there's Andy Mayer. Andy from our friends along the road at the Institute for Economic Affairs. Now, Andy has a couple of questions in the chat panel, but I'm actually going to try and put you on the spot a little, Andy. I know you want to talk about the what you call the green growth paradox, but just obviously you're from the IEA, the free market think tank. What's the free market answer to this question of how do we go about allocating these costs across generations? What's a free market approach to intergenerational fairness?
Thank you, James. I think you'd find there's a great deal of agreement on the points made about carbon pricing being the right mechanism for delivering intergenerational, however so set. Just not necessarily agreement about the need for a very high level to hit the target that has been laid down in law as being necessary within the UK alone.
But I think sorry, just to be clear, so you essentially, if we were to distill this down to a binary choice of borrow or price, you'd rather a pricing mechanism.
Yes, although as I say, there wouldn't be agreement necessarily about the goal.
Good. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. That's a sort of core focus, but I interrupted, Andy. Go on.
Sure, and the other point to raise is that the intergenerational question is clearly crucial, and generally the free market side of the debate takes the view that young people are excluded from far too many political discussions, so housing being another classic example. But you've also got to consider the international fairness question, Clearly, that takes different forms. There's the viewpoint from the developing nations that the West needs to do far more and they need to do far less. But there's also the point that if you simply put a unilateral carbon price on the United Kingdom, we will end up subsidizing, for example, the development of the Chinese solar industry, which has been the experience to date, and destroying domestic industry, particularly in the supply chains to green industries, that we then create the green growth paradox through by undermining our own ability to compete.
Thank you, earlier. Now, well, Vera and Bill being well-behaved panelists, they're putting their hands up because they're keen to respond. So I saw Vera's hand go up first, and then Bill. But Vera, what do you make of Andy's thoughts on green growth paradox?
Yeah, well, I find that the big question to anybody who is a free marketeer is really, is the market economy and the whole principle of the market really rising to the challenge of net zero? And I would say, I'm not so sure. And I'm the last person who is, because you put in your chat, oh, yikes, more centralized decision. It would be lovely if we had seen, the market really rise to the challenge of net zero in the last 10 years, for example, without government. And the government, you've got a government that is probably the free market that you can think of in the last sort of 20 years. So you've got a free market government about deregulation, letting the market make the decisions, let the market drive this whole agenda. And where's the free market been? Yeah, we are not hitting any of our targets. And increasingly, as a politician, you think, is this really going to work if I let the free market get along with it? And aren't there many more decisions that I, as a government, need to actually take and intervene into the free market in order to get us to net zero by 2050?
Thank you very much, Vera. Bill.
Oh yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question. I think my response to your second point, which is about the green growth paradox, I think that we need to be careful of assuming that we can have really high levels of growth during the transition, even if the global market was properly coordinated. Now, there's actually quite a lot of debate around this. For instance, a lot of the assumption that we can have really high levels of growth depends on some technologies which are not actually proven. So, for example, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and this introduces a lot of uncertainty. So, what we're saying is that essentially, in order to deal with that uncertainty, this is why we need to ensure that we have a lower discount rate, and also it also means that even if we can't have that growth, then when we allowed for that possibility in the discount rate, I think we also need to be careful about getting our priorities straight. Right, the priority here is that we need to hit our net zero target, and what's clear, and this came out in a report from the House of Lords a few months ago, is our carbon prices just aren't high enough at the moment to hit that target. There's actually a bunch of carbon values produced by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and they essentially backcast from our 2050 target. They represent the absolute kind of upper limit that carbon prices would need to be. But even if we just took half of those values, we're nowhere near half of those values at the moment. And so even if we're being really conservative, carbon pricing just is not high enough. And I think that we need to be clear, the first priority has to be to hit the target. We have to hit the target. Even if that's bad for domestic growth, right? Even if it ends up meaning that growth is really low, at least we've accounted for that in our discount rate, and we've made sure that it doesn't have an adverse impact on future generations. So that's what we're kind of trying to bring out in the report. But yeah, thank you for your question. It's a really interesting point.
Thank you very much. Now, in terms of names I'm writing down, I think I don't know if briefly James Fotherby from the Green Alliance. Your name appeared on my list of people who want to ask questions, but before, I don't know if you still want to ask questions, James, but before you do that, I actually want to put in a question that was from the chat panel raised by Sagar, which I'll just paraphrase, I think, because it was slightly touched on by Andy a little. And so, Sagar's question was, why is this a room full of you telling us about a room of people telling us about Why is this room telling us about white privilege and climate change dictated by an all-white, highly privileged room of rich white people? As Andy, Andy, to broaden it a little bit, Andy Mayer pointed out that there's the international aspect to this question as well. So how do we factor in, just to complicate the equation, how do we factor in both the intergenerational distributive aspects of this question alongside the current and future international and inter-community distributional questions of Nazaric? So obviously Andy mentioned China, which often comes up in these conversations. How do we factor in the interests of China today and China in 20 and 30 years' time on its current growth trajectory? Because this conversation wasn't complicated enough already. So I don't know who. Vera, you get paid to answer difficult questions for a living. How do you make this internationally fair as well as intergenerationally fair?
Well, indeed, and that was a big question that COP26 was grappling with. I don't know what your real name is, but I saw your question, Saga, in the maybe that is your name. I saw your question in the Q&A. Why is it full of white privileged people? Well, I was invited and I came along, but I respond to invitations. So yes, of course, I think it is important that we engage with as many people as possible, and they come and have their voices heard and get invited and say, I want to say something. And I do recognize that when we're talking about different communities from different ethnic backgrounds, how we are still poor to engage with them. And I know that from Bath, where I've got a big white middle class constituency, where it is difficult to come forward if you come from a different ethnic background, to say, here I am, and I also want to talk, mainly because people don't dare. Yeah. So how do we encourage people from different backgrounds within Britain, let's not talk about the global thing, to come forward and really say what they think about this? And I know, here I sit and I feel confident to talk about things. And if you have never done this, or if you have no role models of doing these sort of things, then you're more reluctant to actually come forward. But please don't think that we don't try. I really, really, really try in Bath to engage with communities who are more hidden. I want to hear their voices. I want them to come forward. I want to hear what they have to say. And it is difficult. It takes time. But please don't think only because I'm white I'm not trying. And in terms of the global question, is indeed, many politicians have made the case that we absolutely need to make financial packages available for particularly poorer countries in the southern hemisphere. To make that happen, and an attempt is being made. Of course, it's not gone as far as we wanted to, but I think it is definitely recognized by richer, wealthier countries that this whole thing is not going to work globally unless there's also financial assistance to the poorer countries.
And just Sarah's asking to come on mic. And what I was going to do, Sarah, was I was going to get the thoughts of the panel to your question, and then ask you to come on and respond to that. So if you just don't mind waiting while we hear from Bill and I think Angus for their thoughts, and then you can then we'll hear from you. So Bill, what's international and intergenerational fairness?
This is an excellent question. Thank you both very much for those. So I should say, when we're talking about discount rates in the report, we're talking about discount rates which apply to the whole world. We're not just thinking about the UK should be thinking about its own economic growth in 30 years' time. We're talking about the distribution of resources across the world. And one of the things that we really bring out in this report is that current UK policy does not pay sufficient attention to global inequality, right? Because even if you think that growth is going to be really high in 30 years, right? And so future people will be richer than us. So they'll be able to afford some of taking on the cost of this transition. Actually, if wealth is just horrendously unequally distributed around the world, and poorer people in the poorest countries have not seen their incomes grow at all, we should absolutely not be discounting their their well-being. We should not be discounting it at all, really. And another point to make on this is that we're not just concerned about impacts on economic growth, we're also concerned about impacts on people's health, on their lives. So climate change has the potential to kill a very large number of people. This would be, this would be disproportionately concentrated in poorer parts of the world. And this also implies the need to drag the discount rate down, so that we place more emphasis on future generations in the poorer world who may be experiencing those effects. So I would say we've really tried to incorporate those concerns as much as we can into the report.
Thank you, Angus. Do you need to add another word to the title of the Intergenerational Foundation? Do you need to be intergenerational and international foundation?
We think we've bitten off quite a lot. We don't want to try and chew too much, but I do fully agree with Bill's point that I mean, going back to the question, of course we all favour more diversity, but actually we should be pleased that a bunch of privileged people, mostly white, are in a room talking about making sacrifices, either the sacrifice of borrowing more to get to net zero, or the sacrifice of paying much more for their carbon in order to get to net zero. So I don't see it quite as hypocritically as that, but of course it's a provocative question. There are people who are missing in the room. By definition, they're the unborn, and that in a way is something of the unborn, whether they're black or white, or any other ethnicity. So we're or any nationality. So we're here concerned about the people who are missing in the room, or who may never get into the room. I mean, as Bill says, cutting carbon will be particularly good for Bangladesh and India and the Philippines, and so I think this is an international, as Bill says, an international as well as an intergenerational question.
Thank you, Sagar. I don't know if you're there. If you would like to come on mic and give us your past judgment on what you've just heard in response to your question.
Yeah, all right, man. Thank you for putting me on the mic. I've been to hundreds of events like this on Zoom, offline, before lockdown, after lockdown, everything. Thousands all across London, from grassroots to environment to Parliament, everywhere. And I'm told about white privilege. And then I figured that out. I was like, hold on a second. White privilege is not amongst my white friends. It's not amongst the white people on the streets who are impoverished and are only affording one meal a day for their children. Then I'm talking about racism. And then I realized that most of the racism I'm experiencing is within the climate change movement. Most of the solutions which are being put in the IPCC report are ripping out my forests for the lithium, for the cobalt, for the green solar panels. So I really have to question not just this inert privilege that is in this room, and it's not good enough to say you are waiting for the unborn. You have now literally castigated and pushed aside all the ethnic majority that are right across the world online that could easily be invited right now. So thank you for showing this inert racism again. But I'm really quite ashamed and disgusted by another Zoom where you couldn't even, I mean, this room shouldn't even be done if you can't even pick up an Indian, Chinese, or African person from another side of the world. But my opinion is the green renewables are a Ponzi scam. They are based on ripping out resources and a forest from my parts of India, from Africa, and it's based on slavery. It's based on slavery of mostly women. And then how are you going to deal with the resources back in the UK? They're all mostly dumped back in Africa. So who's benefiting? It's not Barclays, it's not HSBC, it's BlackRock and Vanguard. And no one's talking about that. But this room as it stands, I really feel like just jumping on, just like I do in many rooms offline, and just say, give me the seat or just leave. But I'm really quite disgusted. Stop this nonsense of castigating all white people as racist and privileged when it's in the climate change movement. And those white people who cannot afford the bills, and like me who can't afford the bills, what about that? I mean, it's like push up the carbon price. It's already bleeding people to death anyway. But I'm really quite confused as to what's the direction of this talk. What's the direction of climate change and the SDGs? It's for the highly privileged, taking resources from the impoverished. Thank you.
Thank you for your thoughts, sir. I mean, the purpose of the talk, as we've discussed, was to talk about the intergenerational allocative questions around net zero, and that's taken us on to the points that you've raised. So, thank you very much for joining us in terms of your challenge as to how freely available this talk is. It's available to everybody. We are the SMF is a charity. We stage these events in order to discharge our charitable purpose of improving public policy. The same is true of, say, the Institute for Economic Affairs, which is why Andy Mayer is here to talk about these things. And it was Andy Mayer, I think, raised some of those exact points you mentioned about the interests of developing nations. So this is what we do. I appreciate you're not entirely impressed with some of the things you've heard or the way we've gone about it, but this is what we do, and this is what we'll keep doing it. And so we hope to see you again at future events. So thank you for the thought. Now we've got about 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes left. Is there anybody else in the audience who would like to come in with a thought or a question? I saw a brief hand went up from John at the Intergenerational Foundation, but then it went down again. So I don't know if John, is that something? Was that an accidental click of the button, or was that something that we've already answered? John Hobby is the co-author of Bill's paper that we've published today at the SMF on this intergenerational question. There is nothing from John.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, John?
Sorry, yes. So as James just mentioned, I'm one of the co-authors of this report. I had a quick question sort of mainly aimed at Vera. So you mentioned that sort of a net zero delivery body would be part of your platform to deliver net zero, sort of as part of sort of the Liberal Democrats' plan to deliver net zero. How do you feel about the Right to the Future Generations bill, which is currently under debate in the Commons, to sort of actively deliver long-term policy? So do you feel that could be successful?
I'm a signature of that. I absolutely, I'm signed up to all of that. And if that's not publicly clear, who have been a signature to these bills, absolutely. And I think Wales have passed that legislation, and I've been pushing for the last couple of years, I think, that the British government stroke England should follow suit. It makes sense, and it absolutely gives government some sort of obligation to think long term, in the same way as we have actually legislated for net zero. Because if once something is like this in law, even if it's a little bit like pushing the can down the road, it does actually it does place an obligation on government to do something about the law that's sitting there. So if you pass that law, I think that would be a step forward, and I'm an absolute supporter of that. I just sort of like to go back to the previous speaker, Saga, and I'm sorry that you feel disgusted. When I was young, I felt disgusted about a lot of things too, and I've understood that politics is, unfortunately, and here's the question, the market, democracy, can democracy really rise to the challenge of this enormity? Yeah, and of course we can all sit here having egg on our face and say, oh God, it's not good enough. But if we did nothing, that would be even worse. So in all my long political life, and I started to get politically active at the age of 16, I have understood, and I've understood that politics, particularly when it comes to really complex issues, is a step of is going in small steps and never fast enough if you're young. But if we did nothing, that would be even worse. And at least there are organizations like the Social Market Foundation, the Intergenerational, the IF, who are really putting their mind to it and are honest about trying to resolve these issues. And I will never, I go out of all these things which look really bleak and think, never let's get up hope. And including what you're raising, never let's give up hope that we can do that fairly across generations and across countries and across ethnicities and across nationalities. That is what we got to do, and we know that.
Thank you very much, Vera. Now we've got 2.5 minutes left. So I'm actually just going to go turn to the other two panelists, Angus and then Bill, for essentially just closing thoughts. What's the one thing that you would like to add to this conversation that we haven't much touched on, or what's the one thing you think that people should take away from this? And then with that, we'll do those closing thoughts, and then we'll wrap up for the morning and bid you all farewell. So Angus Hanton, what's your what should people take away from this session this morning, do you think, in a nutshell?
Well, of course, every research paper ends by saying more work's needed, and this is the ultimate area, how to deal with getting to net zero, the ultimate area where more work is needed, whether it's needed by the Social Market Foundation or us or everyone, probably everyone. And the final thought really is this: the Social Market Foundation is naturally inclined towards market solutions. And here is a market solution.
That's what it says in the tin. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. And here is an area where it seems to me that most people, everyone really, should agree that there's a market solution that works very well, which is carbon pricing. Because you manage with carbon, even those who are keen on other interventions, and we can see other interventions that will help as well. But carbon pricing does two separate things, each of which is helpful towards getting towards net zero. It raises revenue, which can be used for all sorts of things, subsidizing green energy and so on. But it also reduces consumption. So it's a double win. It's a point that's made by Bill in his paper, and so we should be in favour of it. Although, of course, we need to be aware that higher energy prices are a problem for in all sorts of other ways and for all sorts of other people. But it is a double win, and in principle, carbon pricing is key, I think, to solving this.
Thanks, Angus. Bill, you've now got about 35 seconds to sum this all up magisterially.
Yeah. So just to quickly come back on Angus's point, we are proposing a market-based solution, which is carbon pricing, but this is not a free market solution, right? So what we're talking about is quite stringently guiding markets towards a particular outcome, or if you like, pushing them towards a particular outcome through taxation or through quantity controls, right? So what we're trying to do is guide markets in a way which is intergenerationally fair, which I think is kind of what the SMF is.
And may one day become the basis of a fruitful conversation between us and our friends from the Institute for Economic Affairs. Andy, if you're still with us and listening, maybe we should schedule that one for later in the year. Now it's 11 o'clock. That's the point we should end this session. So I'm going to say thank you very much to everyone in the audience for joining us today. Thank you very much to Vera Hobhouse taking time out of her busy parliamentary day. Thank you to Angus Hanton, our friends at the Intergenerational Foundation. Especially thank you to Bill and John for their excellent paper published at www.smf.co.uk. Please read it. Please email us. Let us know what you think. Hope to see you again for another one of these. Hopefully back in person instead of off the dreaded Zoom one day. But with that, I will say thank you very much and have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you.